Welcome to A Fresh Face in Hell. I'm your host, Jonathan Evison. Every week we talk to someone new and interesting, somebody intellectually curious, somebody who will hopefully renew our faith in this cold, cruel world we live in. A fresh face in hell. So today I want to talk about misinformation. We're literally drowning in it these days, whether it's fake news, conspiracy theories, inflammatory memes, misleading headlines, whatever. Misinformation is out of control, and it's become, I think, the defining problem of our era, and I don't think that's an exaggeration at all. I mean, it threatens the integrity of our democracies, it inhibits our ability to cultivate trust in our relationships, it threatens our physical and psychological well-being, and yet pretty much every attempt to combat it has proven inadequate. So we're going to talk about a book called Foolproof today. In Foolproof, Why Information Infects Our Minds and How to Build Immunity, Sander van der Linden, one of the world's leading experts on misinformation, is going to lay out a crucial new paradigm for understanding and defending ourselves against what he calls the worldwide infodemic. Why are we so vulnerable to information? How do we navigate a world where literally almost every piece of information we encounter, particularly online, seems suspect? Fake and inaccurate AI posts certainly aren't helping. How do we immunize ourselves from the infodemic? Today promises to be a fascinating conversation with Sander van der Linden doing, I suspect, most of the heavy lifting. So, Sander, thanks for joining us on A Fresh Face in Hell today, all the way from England.
Yeah, pleasure to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
So, as we talk about this misinformation, first of all, I want to ask, I'm a writer, I should know this, but misinformation, disinformation, it seems to me there's a difference, right? Disinformation is more of a sort of willfully disseminated untruths, and misinformation is just wrong information. Do I have that right, or?
Yeah, that's right. So misinformation, can be information that's either false or misleading in some way, whereas disinformation is misinformation coupled with some intention to actually deceive people willfully, as you said. And so it's more nefarious than misinformation.
Right, and it seems like the problem we're having actually has more to do with disinformation almost at this point.
Absolutely.
And as I understand it from the book, that the human brain has a particular vulnerability to misinformation, right? There's cognitive biases.
Yeah, there's a few of those. One's called a truth bias, which is that, for most of our history, although rumors have always existed, most of the time people assume that most things they hear are true because, for a long way, that's always been the case. I mean, there's a cost of lying. If you think about it in terms of evolution, if people are constantly lying, their reputation wouldn't hold, and people wouldn't be able to trust anyone, cooperate, and so it all would go nowhere. So we're kind of used to people, being honest most of the time while dealing with the occasional lie. But when you shift to environments like social media, where in fact the baseline of misinformation is much higher, then those heuristics don't work so well. And another one of these cognitive biases that's related is called illusory truth, which is just a simple fact that the brain is faster at processing information that's repeated to you than information that hasn't been repeated. So if you repeat a false claim, your brain is processing it at a faster speed than if you hadn't repeated certain misinformation. And that processing speed is taken as a cue for veracity. And that's why liars like to repeat their lies, because they know people get used to them, become faster at processing them, and over time start thinking that they're more true than they would have otherwise. And that's called illusory truth. And that works on kids, it works on adults, it works on most people. And you don't even need to repeat it that often. Just a single repetition already makes people more likely to think that a statement is true.
So it's interesting. It's like, I mean, by hearing something over and over, you've already kind of burned the sort of neural pathway. So it just takes that shortcut right away before, which is a kind of a good built-in defense against this thing about lying, which we all know from ever trying to pull off a lie, is that the thing about the lie is that it must constantly sort of reinvent itself, right? You either, think about somebody who's under cross-examination, you know what I mean? They just keep hitting them for the same details again and again and again to try to get them to slip them up. So it's almost like taking the more simple tact of just repeating the same information, you almost sort of condition them. Is that correct?
Yeah, and in fact, over time, there's research that shows that over time, people think it's less immoral to share misinformation because you normalize it, and that's why when you start out and you look at the history of propaganda, even figures like Hitler, or you might even say some modern politicians, the more
Whoever
often
could you be talking about?
who could we be talking about?
Yeah.
The more often you repeat a lie, the more normal it starts to seem over time to people. Even if it starts out being kind of ridiculous, over time people actually become used to it, and that's a dangerous kind of process where the sort of subtle manipulation happens and people aren't aware of it.
So the misinformation kind of spreads similarly to a virus. You're explaining in the book. Can you extrapolate on that?
Yeah, yeah. And some people are like, "Well, are you suggesting we're all like passive vessels becoming infected with pathogens?" I mean, the reason why I say that in the book is because we use models from epidemiology that are used to study the spread of viruses quite literally, and we adapt them to social media data, for example. And indeed, what you find is that those models, and one of those models is called a suscepted, infected, recovered model, is that there's a population of people, right? Everyone's susceptible. Some become infected. Some eventually recover. But the gist is that if you're in a social network, you're exposed to misinformation. You share that to other people. So now you're a node in a network, right? And you become infected, and then you share it with other people in your network, and they share it, and before you know it, the whole network becomes infected with this information. And of course, people have different levels of susceptibility. You're not gonna believe something the first time you hear it. Maybe you need to be nudged a couple of times, but the basic model is still the same, that it spreads like a virus.
Yeah, and well, as you say this, I'm thinking of cults and cult leaders, and sort of the way that they recruit their followers, which is
Right, yeah.
generally has something to do with particular vulnerability, not even maybe just psychological, but just vulnerability. I mean, I look at all the kids that Charles Manson gathered around, broken
Right, yeah, yeah.
homes, sort of, yeah. How do elements like socioeconomics and IQ play into
Yeah.
people's particular
Susceptibility, yeah, yeah.
susceptibility?
I know what you're
Thank you.
saying, yeah. I mean, the viral model is in some ways simplistic in that it assumes that everyone has a chance of becoming infected, but of course, reality is more complex in that some people are more susceptible than others, right? But differential susceptibility also happens with real biological viruses, so that's something you can model, but it is important. And some of these differences have to do with we have a test called the Misinformation Susceptibility Test, which is a standardized instrument that scores people and benchmarks them against the U.S. population. And we know that some of the things that differentiate people is that if you're high on distrust of official institutions, of the media, you're more likely to be susceptible to misinformation. If you get most of your news from social media instead of regular media, if you're high on what we call Machiavellian trades, so the need to sow chaos and care more about yourself than other people high in narcissism, you're more likely to believe in misinformation. Um, um, there are some other factors as well. So something we call actively open-minded thinking. So people who are low on being actively open-minded, which in a different way means you're kind of cognitively rigid, which means that you don't have a lot of flexibility in your thinking. Like it has to be one way, and you don't deal with uncertainty very well. You don't like to be open-minded about different hypotheses, about different ways of thinking about the world. Those people are very susceptible to extremist rhetoric and propaganda. Um, but those are psychological variables. Like you were mentioning some structural kind of variables. So we know from other work that we do on extremism and how people are recruited into things like extremist organizations is that the way that they target susceptible people is, okay, well, who's unemployed at the moment, who's flunking out of school, who doesn't have friends at the moment, who has a gap in their social network, who's feeling rejected, who's marginalized. So they try to find individuals who are in a susceptible state, either psychologically, kind of structurally in a social sense, or both, and then they try to target them with manipulative information.
It's so insidious.
It
And
is,
then
yeah.
there's a lot of clearly AI isn't helping our cause, right? Like, we're going to talk as
No,
I want to evolve into the solutions and,
sure.
and what you call the inoculation, but like, Just in the last few months, the perpetuation of AI has just been. I mean, it's now when I see any kind of picture on a social network, like a beauty shot or anything like that, I'm at the point where I'm assuming it's false. And it's not because, "Oh, that looks too beautiful to true." Sometimes my brain fact checks it. Like, if I see something and it's a photo of Olympic National
Mhm.
Park, which is my backyard, and I'm like, "No, that's not right, because that's kinda supposed to be Lake Crescent, and that's supposed to be Hurricane Ridge, and that shouldn't be there." But, um do we reach with AI, do you think, are we gonna reach a saturation point where everybody is going to, because you look at the comments, and now it's already, even just in a couple month period, I'm starting to see, at first 2 months ago, people go, "Oh my god, that's so beautiful." And then there'd be one guy that goes, "That's AI, that's fake." And now it seems like sort
Yeah.
of collectively we're starting to develop a little bit more immunity. If I go through the comments now, more people will be debunking it than they were 2 or 3 months ago.
Yeah, so AI, I would say, is a massive problem for various reasons. The sort of micro targeting that bad actors tend to use, which is to target people based on their known vulnerabilities, whether those are psychographic things like personality or your prior beliefs, and they craft messages to try to appeal to those beliefs. But it used to be the case that you had human like troll farms doing this, so you have to figure out hundreds of variations on the message to try to find out what sticks with people. But now AI can superpower those processes, so they can automate the process of writing hundreds of variations of fake messages to try to see what will get people to click. And so that's really boosting the process of online manipulation. You have deep fakes, of course, that are becoming more and more realistic. There's the obvious ones that everyone knows are fake, but some of the ones are getting realistic. We saw the robocalls during Biden's campaign that can confuse people at minimum in terms of where to vote, how to vote, when to vote. Um, in the future, I think deepfakes are going to be so realistic that people are going to struggle to figure out what's synthetic and what's real. And sort of cues that we use to help people now are not going to be so relevant in the future. And to some extent, it's going to be augmented, right? People's interaction with the world is going to be partly virtual, so it's going to become augmented. And so I do think we're moving towards a kind of a blurred, not tomorrow, but thinking about the next 20, 30 years, we're certainly moving towards a more blurred line between what's virtual and what's real. And maybe that's a good a good thing for technology in some aspects, but for helping people discern reality, it's that's not a great not a great development, I think, because from research we know that people can't do it. So people barely do better than chance in trying to figure out what's a synthetic deep fake and what's the real version. And it's hard. I mean, I'm supposedly an expert, and I would probably not do much better than chance on those exercises as well. And so it's just really difficult. I find it interesting that a lot of people seem to be appealing to Orwell, Brave New World. As an author, I don't know how you think about this, but of course, in those books, you have a centralized entity that's trying to manipulate the information environment. But a lot of people are sort of proclaiming that we're moving towards an Orwellian society, and I find that kind of interesting to reflect on from a psychological perspective. But I hadn't really thought of it as from an author point of view, in terms of actually writing fiction that actually bears on reality in interesting ways. But um, I think it's an interesting reference, and people tend to use it for information they don't like. If anyone's sort of controlling the information environment, they're being Orwellian, whether it's industry or government or maybe robots in the future.
Well, we keep using that word nefarious. So, I mean, when you say that, do you think that that isn't the central problem? That it isn't like the overlords trying to socially engineer us through misinformation and disassociation and division, or do you just think this is a matter of technology perpetuating so fast and accelerating that it's just sort of like out of control?
I think it's more of the latter. I do think that there's bad
Interesting.
actors that are organized. Uh, there's evidence of foreign interference in elections. I do think that people are actively trying to undermine democracy, that there's the clustered networks and efforts to do that. Um, uh, but I'm not so convinced that that there's a whole enterprise of social engineering happening at the scale of sort of Orwellian manipulation. Um, I'm, I suppose if we're talking about the U.S. landscape at the moment, I think it's a whole different discussion. I think when the censorship issue comes in, that's a whole different can of worms, I think, and that also has to do with the reference to Orwell or Brave New World, of course, um, because there's a lot of talk about free speech, and I think the people who often make reference to Orwell are seeing some sort of attack on free speech coming from people who do research on misinformation. They see the whole concept of misinformation as a threat to free speech, maybe because they want to perpetuate manipulation campaigns in some way. Um, but there are attempts in the United States right now to actually censor people who work on this issue under the banner of free speech, which makes the whole thing pretty ironic. That we want more free speech by eliminating research, for example, on particular topics, which of course is um, kind of runs contrary to the whole philosophy. But what I do find interesting is that there is this sort of perception from multiple sides that actors are trying to gain control over a narrative and censoring other people in the process. And I do think that's a bit of a problematic state of being.
So, obviously, we've touched a little bit on social networks and the obvious role they play in the dissemination of misinformation. How do we safeguard against this? There used to be gatekeepers and things were fact checked, and we got our information from a more limited, you know, source. And now anybody can get out there and just throw their
Exactly.
truth up there. Uh, I mean, a big part of the book is about safeguarding against this. And so,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think, as you said, we used to with legacy media, and I don't really even like that term very much, but yeah, the idea is that you had editors, you have fact checkers, you have producers. There's multiple layers of checking, and of course, there was some erosion of this with the onset of cable news, but with social media, all of the guardrails are off, right? And so anyone can say what they want. There is no barrier to entry. Everyone's their own journalist. Everyone's putting news out there, totally unregulated. Nobody's checking the veracity. There used to be some moderation happening on these platforms, but that has been, minimized now in the current political environment. And in fact, I see them doing less and less of it. So it is the wild, wild west. And so, we've been looking at um, if we can't systematically rely on social media companies or governments, whom both we have worked with in the past, but how do you help people protect themselves? And that's how we arrived at the inoculation metaphor, that if misinformation spreads like a virus on social media, what can we do to stop it? And one idea is to try to vaccinate people preemptively.
okay, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Is this what we talk about when we use the term pre-bunking or?
Yeah, yeah. So I came up with the term pre-bunking to make it easier for people to differentiate it from debunking. So debunking is the kind of standard thing that most fact checkers do, right? So there's been misinformation. We've all heard it, and now we have to debunk it and say it's not true. And it's a huge disadvantage strategically, because what happens is that you have to repeat the misinformation. Oh, somebody said something about Jonathan that turns out not to be true, right? But that actually just repeats the misinformation. As we've said before, that can strengthen the associations people have in their mind with the misinformation. The corrections tend to be long and complex and sciencey, and so people kind of forget about that along the way. And so wouldn't it be better to try to prevent people from encoding misinformation into their brain in the first place? And that's how you get to a more sort of prophylactic mindset about, well, can you pre-bunk rather than debunk? And that's done to this vaccination analogy, which is exactly the same as the biological analogy. So rather than just giving people only facts, what you actually do is you expose people to a weakened dose of a falsehood or the techniques used to produce falsehoods, and then you deconstruct that in advance for people. You show people the manipulation, you show them how it works, what's the trick, so that people can build up mental or cognitive immunity to it in the future. just as bodies produce antibodies to viruses when you're injected with a vaccine, so that you become more immune to it in the future. And that's we found it works the same way with the brain. The brain needs a lot of micro doses of what deception, manipulation, disinformation looks like. What's the structure of it? How does it behave? How can you recognize it so that when you're exposed to the full dose later on, and we do that, and we get ethics approval for that in research departments, right? That when we bombard people with misinformation later on, we find that they're more immune if we've pre-bunked it.
This all is logical, makes complete sense to me, but I'm having trouble getting my brain around, like, the environment for this. Like, how is this working? I could see how that would work in
Yeah.
a sort of individual therapeutic
Yeah. Yeah.
setting where I had just one individual who was suffering from,
Yeah.
misinformation, and we said and we would debunk them personally. But how does this work on a more massive level? And you talked about getting the go ahead to get this, and, like,
Yeah.
explain to me how this works on a massive level.
Yeah, so the scalability was an issue. So we did start out, getting people into the lab and, pre-bump vaccinating them and then letting them sit behind the computer and browse some falsehoods. And, that works. But the problem is, how do you roll this out? How do you scale this
Exactly.
from a scientific theory into reality? So we had to rely on some real world partners. And one of the ideas we had, or we got from journalists, was like, they said, okay, but you can't pre-bunk, every myth that's out there. Kind of a similar problem that fact checking faces. It's like an uphill battle. So we started to think, like, well, maybe we can vaccinate people against the more general techniques that are used, like polarization, creating us versus them mentalities, conspiratorial thinking, emotional manipulation, like fear mongering about topics, and so on. Um, and because that's common to a lot of variants of misinformation, regardless of what the specific topic is.
I feel like they
Um,
don't show us the middle, like the media shows us. I mean, because, if it bleeds, it leads kind of thing. We get a lot of our, information about the fringe on both sides. And then meanwhile in our lives, say, if we're gonna look at the sort of political spectrum, I mean, you know, the overwhelming majority of the people I know kinda lean a little more centrist. You mean they might be left or right, but they're
sure.
kind of like there's so, I mean, that seems like a place to begin, right? Is to just remind people that there's this whole middle.
If it bleeds, it leads is one of the techniques that we cover, as well as the polarization technique, right? That's all about pulling people away from the center. And the question was how to do that without having to get people to the lab. So one of the first things we did was we created a game, and we thought we'd gamify the whole approach because who wants to go and like come to the lab? So we thought maybe people want to play a game, and then we thought
Smart.
how do we make it interesting for people though? And so we actually created a game which is called Bad News at the time. We actually let people step into the shoes of an online manipulator in terms of experiencing the weakened dose. It's all controlled and fictional, of course, but you get a jolt in terms of what's happening. And so you're on social media, so it simulates a social media feed, and your goal is actually to gain followers by making use of weakened doses of these manipulation strategies and untangling them in the process. So yeah, so we're not teaching people like how to use them, but you are exposed to the process, and you're actively kind of figuring out like how they do that, and how it dupes people. And that game became viral just kind of by accident, took off on social media because I don't think people even knew it was an experiment. In some ways, people just thought it was an interesting way to sort of approach the manipulation problem. But it turned out to be a great tool for us for doing experiments and data gathering. And then we got approached by some international organizations to try to help people at scale. So, for example, during the pandemic, we did a version with the World Health Organization and the United Nations, and then that way we're able to reach 200 million people with a massive campaign around the game and target it at people on social media who could benefit, who might be vulnerable, who could benefit from upping their defenses against pandemic, let's say misinformation. We did it with another version of the game with CISA during the 2020 presidential elections with actually Chris Krebs' team, who in the process got fired by Trump because he kept debunking his election-related fraud claims. But they still released our game, which was actually about stopping foreign interference, right? So we were trying to empower Americans to spot the playbook of foreign interference preemptively before the election, and that those are a few tricks. Like you take an innocuous issue, like should you put pineapple on pizza, and then you say, "Oh, the Italians, they're going to be offended. Don't put pineapple on pizza because that's cultural appropriation." And the other side will say, "Well, no, nobody's going to restrict my pizza topping freedoms. This is America." And then you get people riled up, and then you buy bots to amplify both sides, and then you sow chaos in the democratic process. And of course, they don't do it with pineapple pizza; they do it with immigration, abortion. But that's the kind of playbook, and we wanted to expose that playbook preemptively. And so that was scaled, with the State Department at the time. Yeah, and then we worked with some social media companies like Google, who said, your games are fun and they're great, but not everyone's going to play a game. And it's a fair point, right? We need to scale it even further. And so they said, we could do these videos. On YouTube, there's annoying ads that you can't skip. So what if we do pre-bunk video so that before people are exposed to potentially, harmful content, we insert one of these pre-bunks, and then, if people can't skip it, you could scale that to billions of people, worldwide. And so we did some research with them. We tested it. It worked, and they rolled it out. In the end, Google's still doing these campaigns on a voluntary basis, but they didn't make it mandatory, and that's where you get into tricky bits. And it's interesting because their argument is, they're very libertarian, most tech companies in their leaning. So they're like, well, we don't want to force people to be exposed to pre-bunking videos. But it's kind of interesting as a researcher, right? Because you do force people to be exposed to, let's say, ads from Coca-Cola, but free educational videos, that's too much. I suppose it's because they don't make money off of the educational content, right? But corporate ads, they do get money from. And so there's an incentive problem with social media companies that, they do have solutions, but what ultimately gets implemented isn't always what's best for the public, I think. And so now we're going back into education and trying to design national educational curricula to the ultimate. Coming back to your point about IQ, right? The ultimate inoculation: start early.
Good point. So, man, this is a quagmire. It's really interesting that you started with that pineapple pizza analogy, and you can just see how that works into the algorithm in the division. And I'm not unconvinced that it doesn't all start there. And then we move on to immigration, like you're saying, starting them
Yeah,
early.
yeah.
Start dividing them on these simple sort of
Right.
mundane details, and then just I feel like there's this, and I don't know if you've noticed this and exactly how this fits in here, but there's this more and more, I we attribute it to human nature, and but if you look at elections and it's like 50.5% kitties for everybody, 49.5%
Right.
diarrhea for life, or whatever the meme is there. Is there a part of human nature that causes us to divide so equally? Because I've noticed this, say, I'll post 2, like, beta book covers, like, I'll get something from my artistic designer at the
Uh-huh.
publisher, and I'll put and I swear I'll get, like, and I only put it up, I'll say, "I'm gonna put this up for an hour, I'm probably not supposed to be doing this, I hope my publisher's
Sure,
not
yeah.
listening, because 'cause you're not supposed to do this kind of beta testing," but I'll put it up, and, I'll have the blue cover and the red cover, and I just watch the results pour in. And there'll be like a run of blue, 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 and then red, 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 almost like the people are saying, "Oh, there's too many blues. I'm gonna get red." Like it's almost like there's a human nature in people's cognitive,
Hmm.
their cognitive impulse to too much stuff's going one way, so I'm gonna lean the other. Like, does this fit into this? How do we balance this? I mean, it's funny because we're
Yeah.
almost exactly divided on almost every issue. I mean, what have you found about this in your research, if anything?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I do people do like balance. And so there's a risk of false balance. So media outlets, for example, they like to portray, when they're having a discussion, let's say about climate change, they like to invite some people who are skeptical and then some climate scientists. But that actually leads to false perceptions in the public that there's an even keeled debate, right? If they really wanted to do that properly, they would invite 97,000 scientists and 3 people who are skeptical, in terms of what the science looks like, right? That actually 99% of scientists agree that humans play a role, at least in global warming. Um, but there's this sort of tendency to want to represent everything evenly, even when sometimes things aren't even, and that can really distort people's perception. So sometimes I think people do have these perceptions, but actually they don't match reality. It's just because how things are presented. But then people also do like balance as a phenomena. I mean, it feels good to people to psychologically be balanced. But then things are also different cross culturally. So talking about elections, so some elections, are decided very closely, and that's also why I think misinformation can be problematic. Some people are like, "Oh, okay, misinformation, what else is new?" But, when we're talking about a few percentage points, then targeted disinformation, could really undermine the democratic process, right? If people are voting based on false information, and it's just a small difference. Um, and these campaigns, they do find the people in the states, in the swing states, who are vulnerable to where making up their mind, and who are bombarded with potentially confusing information. But let me give you a different example, because I think there are some elections are not based on small margins, and things differ cross culturally. Here in the UK, the Conservative Party was overwhelmingly voted out, also by conservatives, after almost a decade of conservative rule. People were fed up with it. They said they had no confidence anymore, and now we have a Labour government, right, which is more center left leaning. Um, and but conservatives also said, they said, yeah, sorry, we realize people are not happy with us. We're going to have to regroup and then come back stronger with a new proposal next time. And that's kind of still there's no balance there, in that it was fully tilted towards one side, but most people were in consensus. And I think that can be healthy too, if everyone accepts peaceful transfers of power, and things like that, and accept responsibility for not having delivered on certain promises. So sometimes I think you don't always have balance in things like elections or public opinion, and that can be fine too.
That is that's actually very hopeful to hear, because in my mind, I mean, obviously, I'm not keeping close enough track of, UK politics, but,
Mm.
I kind of thought of it, and it had been for a decade. You said they're going kind of more in lockstep with where we were in America. It's really hopeful to hear that a change has been made, and it gives us we only have to wait 6 more years. I got a very, practical one. I think it's gonna, I think everybody can relate to here in America, and probably the UK too, which is that everybody in all our families, we all have somebody who's a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
Like, I mean, I talked to my friend in North Carolina recently, and she was saying to me, like, "You wouldn't believe how many dudes down here believe that, like, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are just standing at the border, like, handing out cell phones and $500 bills to illegal immigrants and stuff, and these people."
Right.
I mean, I know it sounds, I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
some of these conspiracy theories, I mean, flat Earth doesn't even scratch the surface. Like, how do and we've all found, I mean,
Yeah.
it's really hard to talk to these people. They always come back to the common sense argument. "Well, how come I can't see the curvature of the earth," or whatever. Like,
Right.
we talked about common sense earlier, the intuitive versus the critical thinker. How do we talk to these people, these relatives, the weird uncle that fucking believes, that, in Jewish lasers, or, like, I mean, no matter how outlandish, or
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
some of the ones that are a little
Yeah.
more within the pale in terms of believability, how do we talk to them?
Yeah. Well, let me say a few things. The first is that, of course, when we're dealing with conspiracy theorists, people who are deep into it, then we're no longer, we're past inoculation, right? And now we're in a therapeutic zone. And sometimes when you're in a public setting, it can still be useful to pre-bunk or inoculate for everyone else who's around it. But for the person that you're talking to, it's a different ball game. So I have a family member who's also deep into, and not just recently. I mean, ever since I think 9/11. Um, and so I've developed, some strategies based on research that people might find helpful. I think the first is to try to avoid getting stuck in a back and forth on specific details about the conspiracy, because you're never going to win. There's this joke about this guy who's a conspiracy theorist, and unfortunately he dies and he goes to heaven, and when it's his turn, God, he or she is waiting up there personally. And the conspiracy theorist goes and he says, well, God says you get one question before you go in, and he says, well, this whole flat Earth thing, I'm pretty sure it's flat, right? I mean, let's be real, it's not round. And so, God ponders for a second and sort of thinks and says, no, I can assure you, when I designed it, it's completely, I designed it, I know, I'm the ultimate authority, it's completely round. And the conspiracy theorist goes, dang, this thing goes higher up than I thought. And that's kind of the, that's kind of the
It's
idea of,
spherical, not round, by the way. Like,
yeah, right, yeah.
yeah.
And so that's the psychology of it. They will jump levels. So if you try to debunk, they will jump to a higher level. So, but this is incoherent, and they'll say, "Oh, but there's this other actor who's organized it," and. So for example, if you try to say like, "Oh, but how can this really be the case? Oh, well, there's a global conspiracy happening, and all the organizations are in on it, and that explains any local inconsistencies." So try to stay away from doing that. Instead, what I try to do is I borrow a bit from the inoculation in that I try to go at the technique level. Okay, what are the techniques of manipulation, and how might they be used on people? Because what conspiracy theorists really hate is being manipulated. And so they actually, in our research, we find that they're kind of sympathetic to the idea of not telling them that they need to change their beliefs, but kind of unraveling these manipulation techniques. Because they will agree that false dilemmas, polarization, that's all bad. I
So
tend to
interesting.
use
Psychologically, you're trying to find a common ground with them. That's smart.
exactly.
That's like ground zero for persuasion. Yeah, that's smart.
Exactly. So yeah, it's called affirmation in persuasion. So you have to, another way to do it is to say like, well, obviously, Watergate, some conspiracies are real. However, the ones we're currently talking about are, and that's kind of just affirming that people are not crazy. And that helps when starting the conversation. Yeah. And then you kind of have to move. What I do is, for example, say, look, Alex Jones, for years, he said to people that the Sandy Hook shooting were crisis actors, right? For years. And then, he's duped people with this for years. And then in court, he says, no, actually it was true, never mind. And so he has admitted to lying to people for decades. And so, some conspiracies are like a pyramid scheme, right? There's some person on the top who's making all the money who comes up with these theories, then other people are duped into spreading them, and the people on the bottom are suffering. And, you don't want to be the chump at the bottom of the chain. And so generally conspiracies are like, no, I don't want to be that person. What are you talking about? I said and then it's getting to distance themselves a little bit from the idea of being duped by conspiracy theories. And so I find that works a little bit. And then there's some new research which was fascinating, which found that if you get the conspiracy theorists to argue with an AI chatbot, that they're actually more likely to distance themselves from the conspiracy than when they're talking to a human. And I think it's maybe partly because they perceive no bias in the AI, or they assume there's no nefarious persuasive intent. And so actually with the AI
That's
just debunking.
fascinating.
Yeah, it was a fascinating study. And so just getting them, "Oh, you don't want to talk to me, talk to this AI. It's a public AI bot. Talk to the bot, see what you think." And so there's this ways of, but I think what I've learned is that you need to be happy with small wins, because persuasion is a very long process. People are not going to abandon their belief system after a single conversation. So, if you can find some common ground where they've distanced themselves a little, take it as a win, stop there, and then start again at a future point in time. And you got to keep going at it. And we talked about cults earlier. People just don't get out of a cult. It takes a long time for people to be de-radicalized. And so you have to have persistence, you got to have empathy, and you got to use these more indirect techniques that don't challenge specific details, but actually, let people come to terms with it. I have a good colleague, Brent Lee in the UK, who was a devoted conspiracy theorist for 15 years. I often chat with him. He believed in a New World Order, 9/11, satanic pedophiles, and everything. And yeah, he started realizing at one point that he was getting duped by bad actors, and he really didn't like that. And so he started
What
looking
was
into
his
it more.
point of realization? I mean, do you remember? Like what
Yeah,
finally?
yeah.
Because that could be educational.
Yeah, I did ask him about this, and he said that what? So he mentioned that at the time where they started talking about, weather manipulation as well as COVID being a hoax. And so, he's based in the UK, but he was like COVID, the virus being a hoax. He just thought that was too crazy, and he started wondering about what are the incentives for people to say things like that. And I think this is a really good way of what you want to do is
Incentive, that's a good one because that's like with the flat
incentive.
Earth. At some point, they're like, "Okay, so tell me, what does NASA have to gain by telling us the Earth is flat versus spherical?"
Exactly. It's about getting them to ask themselves the question, like, what's the
Yes.
incentive for people to make this up? And like, why would they do that? And so it's asking questions and getting them to generate the answers to sort of create these sort of seeds of doubt in their own mind about what's going on here. And the trouble with conspiracy theories is that you can't fully debunk them because some of these things are just unknowable. Yeah, secret agents are operating behind the scenes, and you know. Um, the problem is that you can't disprove some of these things with 100% certainty, and so it's a fool's errand to try to do that. It's much better to get people to try to unravel, like, how plausible is this really? What are the incentives? Like, why would this happen? Are there alternative explanations? So the one of the antidotes to conspiratorial thinking is being actively open-minded. So the fallacy with conspiracy is that people take the conclusion of what they want to be true, and then they start with that. Like, somebody must be plotting, in secret, some nefarious goal. But if you look at government, my experience with government is that there's a lot of people not talking to each other. One arm has no idea what the other arm is doing, completely unorganized. And so it actually seems like a completely implausible theory that all of these actors are working together. There's been research on this. People have modeled this, that if NASA was plotting to fake the moon landing, 600,000 employees at the time, it would be immediate failure to try to pull off some conspiracy like that in terms of the maths of that actually working out. Even if you just limit it to some of the top echelons. And so yeah, so I often go the plausibility route because the antidote is coming up with alternative theories that are non-conspiratorial, and then our people can widen their thinking and try to distance themselves from it. And that's the hallmark of healthy scientific skepticism. It's not to say no conspiracy is true ever. Right? It's people. I have people that love talking to me about Epstein, and they're like, "Well, but what about Epstein? Do you really buy that the camera just wasn't on the time that he hang himself in his in his cell? Like, this all seems like a cover up." And the truth is, I'm not going to know the truth about what happened to Epstein, but a scientific mindset is that I have various hypotheses. There's weights of evidence on all of these hypotheses. One of those could involve people working together to cover something up, but 10 of those hypotheses could involve a completely non-conspiratorial explanation, and we have to be open to where the evidence goes. And that type of thinking pulls people away from just being focused on, no, there's bad actors plotting in secret, and I need to find the evidence that confirms this. I talk in a book about the gyroscope and the flat Earth experiment. That when they actually do the experiment and they find out that it doesn't work out in the way they thought, they go to, well, the tool must be wrong. And so it's just it's a very motivated, self-enclosed system of thinking, and yeah, you need to nudge people out of that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating I mean, it's that's the best way to persuade is again, I'm thinking about the cross examiner. They're asking them questions, asking them to sort of expose the holes in their own argument and for putting the onus on them to do that. There is this point with certain conspiracy theories where, I mean, I think we're all a little susceptible. Okay, I'll give you
Sure.
one
Yeah.
for example. The National Football League is scripted, okay? Um, like
Uh-huh.
sometimes, look, as a Seattle Seahawk fan who watched the 2006
Mhm.
Super Bowl, it's hard to think that there wasn't even the refs came out after that game and go, "Yeah, we made some bad calls, and, Pittsburgh won the
Right.
game." It was anybody watching it was like, there were some really, really wrong calls or off calls, but the idea that it's scripted, like, how I think help me out here because I know people who think the NFL is scripted. Help me out here with
Right.
your psychology. I guess we're in the therapeutic realm here, but help
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
Give me an argument to try to explain to these people why that's not gonna work.
I would I would ask them, okay, so if it was scripted, how many people would need to be involved in this, right? And then all the people who are watching the live game, they would all need to be duped. Like everyone who's ever worked there knows it's scripted, but has never told anyone that it's scripted. And so you would just get people to ask the questions of like, what's an alternative explanation to it being scripted? Maybe there's other theories we could explore. And where did you hear it was scripted? Like, who would benefit from it being scripted, right? So I think everything we just sort of talked about and getting them to realize that maybe some of these explanations are not so plausible. And even if you get to the stage where they consider other explanations that are possible, but aren't abandoning their conspiracy altogether, that's still a good outcome, because now they're less extreme than before. And then you try again, and sometimes you can sort of think about. In terms of, I don't know all the details about this particular theory, but you want to avoid getting stuck in, as I said, in some of the details about, oh, but what about this, this game, and you can see it on the match here that this was, maybe pre-scripted. You want to avoid getting into those type of details. But it would be obviously far-fetched for it to be scripted. But yeah, you want to get people to raise some internal skepticism, some internal doubt about their own beliefs, some healthy scientific skepticism. And I think that's the best antidote to conspiratorial thinking. To give another example with
Tyson Paul. Okay, this is an example how there's a whole nother layer to this where the conspiracy theorist actually has the power of the information after the fact to sort of reverse engineer a persuasion of their own. So,
yeah,
like, I don't know if you know about the fight, probably, as a fan of boxing, I'm ashamed. The fight really did appear to, I mean, we know that the contract was laden. It's a Jake Paul thing. We know that it's laden with, like, nobody's going to knock anybody out. Like, certain things supposedly were leaked about the contract. But, like, for instance, somebody who said the fight was completely scripted, like choreographed. First of all, that would be
right,
a lot easier to pull off than a football game where you got 22 people on the field at a time. You just got two players in the ring, and it's a dance, and it could be choreographed, like a dance could be
sure,
choreographed.
sure,
But then I saw my son, and who knows everything, and his sources of information are always better than mine. Actually, that's probably true, but he's like, look, Dad, it actually was scripted. Somebody leaked the script, and so what I'm saying is he's like, well, look at the time signature. This was a tweet, and it was 2 days before the fight, but then they took it down, and I mean, and I'm thinking, well, that's something you could fake, right? I mean,
yeah, yeah.
you could fake the time signature on it. I mean, it gets to be such a quagmire after a while when you had this idea that you can actually, after the fact, reverse engineer your argument and to support your.
Your viewpoints, yeah. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is to run people through this acronym CONSPIRE. And so what we found out over doing lots of research is that nearly all conspiracy theories actually have the same predictable structure. And so C stands for incoherence. So often they're internally incoherent. For example, people who believe in conspiracies tend to think that Osama bin Laden was already dead when they found him, and some people think that he's still alive. But they will endorse both conspiracy theories at the same time, but not realize that they're completely contradictory. There's the O, overriding suspicion, something must be wrong. The N stands for nefarious intent. Nobody's talking about a secret conspiracy to, plot a secret birthday party for you, Jonathan. Right? It's always negative. It's
That's
always
bad
somehow.
news.
Yeah, it's always unless you really hate birthday parties, maybe. But it's always kind of a negative thing, right? And then S stands for something must be wrong. P is for persecuted victim. There's always a victim and a perpetrator. I stands for um, um, immune to evidence, so they never update their beliefs to counter evidence. That's one of the hallmarks of conspiratorial thinking. And the R and the E stands for reinterpreting randomness, which is a hallmark of conspiratorial thinking. So, for example, with 5G, there's the 5G is causing coronavirus. But actually, what's happening is that why are there more 5G towers and more coronavirus deaths? occurring together. It's because of a third factor, which is population density, right? Where there's more people, there's more phone mass and more deaths. But you can reverse engineer that into a causal sounding story that one is causing the other. And so you can actually take any conspiracy and like use the conspire to show that all of these elements are present. And when I do that with people, they start to see that, yeah, maybe it's not about a specific theory, but maybe it's a bit fishy that all of these theories have these predictable building blocks. And how is that possible if if each of them are legitimate and true on their own? It's like, no, actually, it's kind of um a I won't say scam, but it's kind of a faulty way of setting up a theory, and they all have the same errors in the reasoning, and you can sort of expose that with that acronym. And I think birds aren't real is a great example of that. Are you familiar with the birds aren't real conspiracy
Oh, yeah,
theory?
yeah,
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 yeah.
they land on the electrical wire to recharge.
To recharge, yep, yep, and
Listen, I've
um,
had enough of them to hit my window and, like, and I have a cat, so, like, I'm here to tell you. That
yeah,
one's not
yeah.
too hard to debunk. It just debunk. It's come into my garage, and every time I pet my cat, the next day I've got a disemboweled bird in my thing, and I'm here to tell you there's no electronics in it. It's just like a
But
little liver.
I
He
think.
licks them all up, and he puts them. He like
Mhm.
recreates the body. Just says, here's the liver, there's the heart. Like it's all there.
I think that's where they messed up. They should have made a conspiracy that's only some birds aren't real, and they have a special pattern, and you have to like go into like all the intricate details of trying to figure out which birds are part of the conspiracy, which makes it much harder to discredit. And so, but yeah, it taps into concerns about privacy, right? And so again, it uses these building blocks to illustrate. Actually, you can come up with like ridiculous conspiracy theories using these same ingredients over and over again. Celebrities, they're always missing. Oh, Tupac is still alive on an island. They've cloned Avril Lavigne. And so, it's always the same sort of stuff. And of course, somebody will say, okay, but at some point in time, it's going to be real, and then you're going to be wrong. And sure, maybe one in every 10,000, it happens to be real. But it's so rare that I think you're going to be okay being skeptical of most conspiracy theories.
So as we're beginning to wind down here, I want to I kind of want to circle back around, and and some of this may be sort of reiterating what you've said in a more compressed way, but like in a general way, I mean, how can we protect ourselves from misinformation? As in, how can we personally implement these strategies in our life? And I mean,
Yeah. Yeah, I think people, we gotta stay vigilant. So pre-bunking and inoculation can be helpful to other people too. And so, give an anecdote. The persons who actually created the videos for us, exposing manipulation techniques in the media, at one point they told me that around the office, when they were listening to politicians on the radio, they started this game who could call out the manipulation technique when they're hearing the debate, and they were actually training themselves to become immune to some of these techniques, like scapegoating groups or polarizing language or ad hominem attacks. And so, that's actually kind of a fun way that people can inoculate themselves. But the biggest favor you can do is that when you know that something's misinformation or that it's manipulative, explain it to somebody else and pre-bunk your, friends and family so that they don't become the victim of misinformation that's spreading. So that's a service people can do. And also, just get your news from diverse sources. Don't get stuck in an echo chamber. Make sure that you're reading from across the spectrum, highly reliable outlets. So every outlet has a leaning, of course, but it also has accuracy rating. So, it matters less maybe what side you're on and more how accurate actually the rating is. And so get your news from high accurate, diverse sources. Get multiple sources for verification before forwarding things, before believing in information. We can't all be a scientist all day at home, but sometimes just double checking information before, you spread it on the internet would be good. I mean, if somebody says that immigrants are eating cats and dogs in Ohio, it's probably best to do some research before we retweet that, without thinking about it, because it actually turns out it can harm people who are living in those communities. And so, I think that's generally beneficial. Um, and then, yeah, try to be open-minded, and in terms of protecting ourselves from conspiracy theories. I think, sure, it's always possible somebody's plotting something in secret, but there's also tons of other possibilities. And just being open-minded, keeping an open mind, having different hypotheses, looking where the evidence is, and not letting yourself be convinced by one or an extremist narrative, I think is really protective of susceptibility to misinformation. Because what extremists often do is they try to get people to, to endorse one monolithic explanation for all events, and come up with a single explanation. And reality is complex. It's rarely the case that something is as simple as one explanation, and that also happens during conflicts, right? There's a lot of misleading content, and so we want to be careful. Is this presented out of context, right? How does it make me feel? Is this meant to fearmonger? Is it meant to get me emotionally riled up? Paying attention to some of these markers of misinformation can help us not fall for it.
He is Sander van der Linden. I had to make up. I gotta say, man, that name I had to make up a little
It's
nursery
three names,
rhyme.
right?
Sander van der Linden
Vander
went to
Linden.
town. Sander van der Linden had a frown. He is Sander van der Linden. The book is Foolproof: Why Information Infects Our Minds and How to Build Immunity in an era when disinformation is rampant. It ought to be required reading, as far as I'm concerned. Sander, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. That was really eye-opening.
Likewise, great conversation. Thanks for having me.
A Fresh Face in Hell with Jonathan Evison is brought to you by Fresh Face Pods and produced by Jason Botkin and yours truly. Check us out on Instagram, YouTube, or at our website at freshfacepods.tv. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter for updates and special content. And if you love the podcast, by all means, run out and buy all of Jonathan Evison's award-winning novels wherever books are sold.